Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's very great of you to join us for today's presentation, which is on managing the estate and mastering product lifecycle, firmware and patch management. This presentation is hopefully going to be useful for any MSPs who are managing products. In today's kind of fast-moving landscape, MSPs face a constant challenge of keeping their client environment secure, reliable and up to date, and devices invariably progress through their product life cycles from introduction to end of sale and end of life, and each of these stages involves some risks and responsibilities. Things like outdated firmware, mispatches and unmanaged life cycles can open the door to vulnerabilities, compliance issues and service disruptions. This presentation should hopefully help answer a lot of those points and give you some good tips on how you can manage your Draytech routers. I'd like to just introduce the presenters today. I'm Alex Schuker, Head of Technical Service and Product here at Draytech UK, and joining me is Joe DC, one of our Senior Technical Account Managers. So the agenda for today is going through product lifecycle planning, so understanding what the end of sale and end of life timelines are and how to think about aligning those with client roadmaps. We've got firmware and patch management best practice. So this is ensuring devices remain secure and up to date, and then some guidance on how to leverage firmware updates and advisories effectively, how to interpret the information that we're providing, and then some stuff around kind of operational excellence. So how to kind of reduce risk when it comes to firmware updates, optimize refresh cycles, and future-proof the client's estates through thinking about some things that can help prepare the client and also yourselves when it comes to the product selection and what things you might have available in the future, because sometimes you can continue using the products for longer than maybe might be anticipated. So that's always something helpful to look into. And then finally, we've got a live Q&A at the end where we'll cover some of your questions. So let's get into the presentation then and start with the product lifecycle planning. So there's a lot of different terms that get involved in the product lifecycle planning. The key parts are related first to the status of a product when it comes to availability. So the first thing is when it's available. So that's when the product is available on sale. It's something that we're selling and is a current product. And then at some point in its life cycle, it will go end of sale. And that's when the product's been discontinued and is no longer available on sale. It's different to when a product's out of stock. Occasionally, a product can be out of stock, so it's maybe not currently available, but doesn't mean that means it's gone end of sale. So that there's key differentiators there. That if we don't have a product in stock for a bit, but it's still available, that doesn't mean that the end of sale date starts or any countdown towards the end of life occurs. Sometimes there can be some, I think, confusion that can occasionally happen because people will kind of direct people to other products, and sometimes there can be confusion around whether or not a product's going end of life or not. But I'll cover some stuff around where we publish information that can help with double checking that. And then the last one is end of life. So that's when the product has reached its end of life date from the point of view of the product's maintenance. So that's a significant date because it has implications when it comes to what security updates it may receive in the future. Here's an overview of the different stages of a product. Generally, a product's life cycle is going to last more than 5 years. We have products that can get up to kind of almost 20 years in total when it comes to when a product was first made available to when it finally went end of life. So it can be a long period. But the first part is when it's available on general sale. During that period, we provide firmware updates, software updates, and general product improvements. So the firmware updates might include adding new features, new functionality that wasn't as part of the launch spec, but also includes any patches, improvements, and also security updates. But it includes kind of maintenance of the features there, and also it includes complementary technical support. So that's provided for the products. Then at some point the product will go end of sale. This will happen for almost all products eventually, because there's new hardware or components might be made kind of discontinued, so we then may need to move to another product. Often it's because newer, better chipsets come out that we can utilize that improve the performance and offer better functionality. And sometimes you can get legacy technologies where the product's no longer relevant. I'm thinking of things like ISDN products there. It would be silly for us to still be selling that. I think there would be very little interest in something that was like an ISDN product. So then the product's discontinued, it's no longer available for purchase, and we would at that point publish an end of life date for it and make an end of sale announcement. The complementary tech support would still continue as well, but the key thing is that the product goes into a firmware maintenance period where, rather than receiving product improvements when it comes to new features, the focus is more on providing security updates. It is still possible for us to do some product improvements, but it's more focused around the security updates, and that period will continue for 3 to 5 years depending on the series. And then at that end point, it then goes end of life, and after that we give no guarantee for any security updates, and complementary tech support still exists, but from the point of view of security updates, they can't be guaranteed, although it is possible for us to release security updates, and we have in the past released updates, and I'll show some examples of that in a moment. So I mentioned it's 3 to 5 years. This depends on the product range. So we've got a few different product ranges at Draytech. There's the SMB routers and firewalls. Those have a 5-year period once the product goes end of sale. And then for so those are kind of the 29, 28 and 39 series of routers. Then the Soho products and the modems, the 27 series, those ones have a 3-year period, and then all our access points are 3 years. And both of our switch ranges, the WebSmart and the Layer 2 Plus switches, are also 3 years. And here's to talk it through. It's helpful to look at dates, to look at some real world examples. So with the Vigor 2860, we released the product in July 2013, and around 4.5 years later, at the end of the year 2017, we announced the product was end of sale, and it was then at that point when we added the 5 years on to have the published end of life date of the end of 2022. And then also for the 2862, we look at that, released 2017. It was actually the successor 2860, so it was released a little bit. You can see there's an overlap though, that there's often an overlap between the two products when it comes to replacing existing models. And then that was on sale for 4.7 years, and then has an end of life date of 2027. A small note on the 2860. Although it did go end of life 2022, the most recent security release we did for it was actually last month. So it is something where we have and frequently do release firmware updates, but there isn't a guarantee that we can do that. But where appropriate, we always try to support the products for as long as we can. If you want to find out the status of a product, then you can go to the product lifecycle menu on the Draytech website. That's on the support section under product lifecycle. There's a URL there that has all the products and will show their product status and the various dates. That's very useful to look at. And when it comes to kind of thinking about estates you're managing and clients you have, it's helpful to use this page and look at the products that are going to be going EOL in the next quarter or two. I've here pulled out from that page a list of the products that are going EOL in 2026. So I think that's something that's important to routinely look at and work through as time goes on, because it can be helpful when it comes to reviewing what's out there and what people have on their estates, and having conversations with them to discuss replacements and upgrades to their estates. Some of the routers we've got a few different models, notably the 2762 is going to be end of life in the 11th of May 2026, and we've got also the 2960 at the end of the year, and then we can see a few switches and APs here. When it comes to alternative products, we also have a different page as well, where we list alternatives where they're available. So, for example, the 2820, we listed on here as the close equivalent was the 2832, but then that's kind of that's an old product, so that one actually lower down has a closest alternative replacement as well. So that's a useful one for doing a bit of a comparison. Also, the comparison charts are very useful for looking at. So when it comes to kind of client roadmaps, there's a few different things to think about. One is kind of what does their estate look like, what products do they have, and what's the life cycle status of those products. But also, what technology changes are there coming up, and that will affect that. Are they looking at upgrades of their internet connections, or are they kind of rolling out new offices, or looking at consuming new services? And relating to that, you can often find that the product that is currently being used can actually potentially be used for other services. And then there's also about planning product model migrations when it comes to, if they do have products that are going to go end of life, then what's the alternative product that's going to be best suited for them. So when it comes to what products they currently have, that can be something that's a bit of a challenge in some situations, but there's a lot of different ways that we can look at the estate. The most common, I think, is using something like Firmware ACS central management, but you can also use things like SNMP, or with SSH, there's things like sysver can show the model information. People may maintain an asset list, or it could be to look through some sales records. In some cases, it's possible for the Dratec account manager could potentially help you with some of that. If there are any gaps that you're trying to work out, it's possible that we would still have some records that can help with that. But when it comes to Firmware ACS, that's, I think, one of the easiest ways to do it. And I've got some screenshots here showing the monitoring devices screen, because it's a really useful page that you can use. So you've got two ways. One is using monitoring devices, and the other one is using the reports and reports task. But I often find the monitoring devices is really handy because it's got a nice download section. So if I just show you the monitoring devices menu here, it shows you all the different devices on the network, the network in the ACS, which network they're in, and whether or not they're online, offline, and the model and firmware version. And there's a very helpful on the left hand side download button. So if you click that, then it downloads a CSV, which gives you all the devices in that network, and then you can very easily use a pivot table with a spreadsheet program to then pull out and look at the model by firmware. So that can be really handy by looking at what devices you've got on the network and what firmware versions they're on, to help identify if there's any that have critical updates that need to be updated to, and also to see which products there are to see if there's any that maybe need to be looked at to be replaced. When it comes to that, of course, it would be a thing of looking at the life cycle status. But the other part of it is technology changes. So with technology, there's a bunch of different internet fixed line connections available in the UK and Ireland, and they all have kind of different connection speeds and different connection types. But one of the things to be aware of is a lot of the Dratec products have two WAN connections, either dual WAN or support failover, and that's where it can come in handy, because you might find that you've got a product that you originally intended for use on ADSL or VDSL, but actually it might already have the capability to be switched over to Ethernet if it's got an Ethernet WAN connection. So when it comes to that, looking at the comparison chart for the product is very handy. So there's technology changes like moving from VDSL to Ethernet WAN, upgrading WAN speeds. So an example here, I've looked at here's the comparison chart for some of our Soho products. The 2763, for example, has a DSL WAN port, but also has an Ethernet WAN and up to 950, so coming up to a gig of firewall throughput on the WAN 2 interface. So that could quite easily be used on FTTP if you happen to have deployed it on VDSL to start off with. But also, when it comes to upgrading WAN speeds, the product selection can be quite important, because if you anticipate there might be some kind of increases in usage in the future, then something like the 3912 might be an appropriate product to go, because then you've got that ability to boost in the future, because it's a 12 gig on the firewall WAN performance. So it means that you could quite easily go from 1 gig up to higher throughputs using the same device. And also with dual WAN as well. So if a client you might anticipate they need to double their internet connection for some redundancy or to boost the connection, then selecting a product that supports that dual WAN capability from the start is a good idea. The same with LTE and mobile broadband failover. Whether or not the product has LTE support can be handy if that's something that might be used in the future. And then another thing around the lifecycle planning is VitalCare, because this adds extra things onto the warranty of a product. So the Dratec products have a 2-year return to base warranty. What VitalCare does is it adds an extra year or an extra 2 years to make it extra 2 or extra 3, so it becomes in total a 3 or a 5-year warranty. And also adds an advanced replacement service on top. This is with a single one-off payment that is a license that then gets an activation code rather, that gets activated against a product. Now this can be really handy to use in conjunction with the product lifecycle, because you could, with VitalCare, by having like the VitalCare 5-year warranty, means that you can tie that in with the likely product lifecycle of a product, and that gives you a good opportunity when it comes to discussing when that's the expiry of that, because then people get the peace of mind that they know that they're going to have the hardware replacement for that for the whole 5-year period, and then at the end of that, then it's possible to then have discussions with them about replacing the product if the product's then got to the end of sale, and then you can then discuss what the end of life periods would be to then discuss about refreshing and moving to the next model. And then another thing is kind of planning model migrations. So one of the things that's I think quite important when it comes to upgrading from one model to the other is considering the evaluation and testing periods to make sure that you're able to utilize all the functionality and the clients are able to do the same things that they were doing with the previous model. So with that, when a product is likely to go end of sale, it's quite handy to consider what your run rate requirements might be, so that you can help with getting the stock to have that as coverage. The Dratec account managers can help with that when it comes to notification and discussions before the products have their official end of sale announcement, because there's normally some notice that we're able to give. But do consider the VitalCare, because it can help give predictabilities around time scales and reassurance for clients. So next thing to look at here is around firmware and patch management best practices. So the first thing related to this is to do with, I think, the firmware notifications. There's a few ways that we notify people of firmware. The primary one is through the firmware mailings of the DRATEC mailing list. So we send regular updates there when we're releasing new firmware, but also primarily around when there's important firmwares that are have security improvements, so marked as critical. There are a few other ways though. We do post on the DRATEC.co.uk download section. You've got a list of all the different models there, and it will clearly show which the latest firmware version is and what the date was that's been released. And we also have device notifications on the web UI as well. So if you log into a dashboard of a unit, it can, in the firmware update section on that, it can check to see what the latest firmware is, so it can tell you. That's a little bit reactive because of course it's not necessarily emailing you or notifying you when it comes to an individual device. You tend to only notice that when you log into a device. But the other thing is the Vigor ACS notifications. So when you log into Vigor ACS, there's a feature now where it will report on the dashboard what new firmwares have been released. So I can just show you that here. So here we've got Vigor ACS, and you can see on the right hand side there's a little pop-up that will show new firmware available. In this case, it's showing that a new firmware is available for the C410AX. And there's also a notification center where it can look at, where it can show you a bunch of different ones, and you can mark those as red. So that's quite useful. But also there's other tools as well that can help prompt. So in the monitoring devices section, there is, next to the firmware column, you can see a little a circle with a tick. Those are color coded. So there's a green circle and a tick, which means that it's the latest firmware, and then a kind of amber circle and a tick means it's a recent firmware that Vigor ACS recognizes, but it's not actually the latest firmware version. So you can see the message it says is this version is fully compatible, and then if it's an older version, it says a message to say that it's not the latest firmware. There can be some situations where Vigor ACS thinks the firmware version is out of date, but it's not actually been released by the on the website currently. In that case, it's normally going to be pretty soon. It's normally going to be within a week or two. But if you do see that message and the firmware is not actually on the website, it doesn't mean that ACS won't support the product. That's fine. It will work kind of with it, but it's just a little message that means that sometimes that happens if we've just updated to the latest version of ACS, and it's predicting what versions will be available because it knows about the release cycle. Also on the dashboard of an individual CPE on the ACS, there's the same tick which shows you if it's the latest or not, and you can click on that and it will actually go to the download section. So if you click on those, it then goes to fw.dratec.com.tw, where you can actually directly download the firmwares from that. The only thing that's not on those is the DSL firmwares, and not on the .com.tw one. They're only listed on the co.uk. In future version of ACS, we're in the process of adding it so that the UK link is the one that ACS will use for UK users. But in the meantime, to get the DSL firmware, you would get it from the DRATEC UK website, or this new URL, the fw.dratec.co.uk, is now live, so you can actually use that to download the firmware and browse the different firmwares and different models. So when it comes to firmware and what's the best guidance, I've got some things here where we talk through how you can interpret and understand the release notes and information that we publish. The key thing that's, I think, essential reading is the release notes for each of the firmware. There's some key bits of information that are very useful that are on all the release notes. The first thing is, one, the firmware version, that's always listed at the top. It will release to give the details, but also it has things about the release details and new features. So we look at the firmware version at the top. It has things around the version. We have it as a system where it's a number dot number dot number. So that's major, minor, and patch. So the first digit tells you whether or not it's DREAS 4 or DREAS 5 or even DREAS 3 for an older model. So that first number it won't ever change. And then we have the next digit 5.1. It can go to 4 numbers if it's a small patch. Sometimes we might release a version that's a small, and you can tell how many different changes there are by how different the numbers are. So if it's gone from 4.4 to 4.5, that's a major jump, whereas if it's gone from 4.5.1.1 to 4.5.1.2, that's a very small jump, so there's probably only a small number of changes. You can look at the release notes and see the release information on that. There's the release type, which is really important to pay attention to. We will either show it as critical or important. Critical means we recommend updating immediately. That would be because there is a security related improvement, some sort of vulnerability patch normally. Important means that we recommend upgrading, and there's some sort of important thing that typically would be if there's some a bug or something that might affect some operation. So in the release notes, it will typically say a Y, and then we have regular, which is upgrade just when it's convenient. So that means it's not something that would be urgent, but we would always recommend updating the latest because it has, there's always good improvements in the later firmware. And then there is also a different firmware type for some of the models. For the 39 series, they have a mainline and a stable. So the stable version just has small increments and generally focuses just on bug fixes and security updates rather than adding new features. So that's the different firmware versions. The release note details are very, very helpful to look at. So in the comments and important notes, I always have a scan through there because there will be some information there, sometimes around if there's any compatibility with firmware and different versions, but the improvements will show if it's got any key things to read. And also if you are coming across an issue, then often it will be noted in here if something's fixed, so it can be helpful if you come across something as well. And the known issues section is very helpful because that shows if there's any issues we're aware of with the firmware version. So there might be in some cases some significant changes in the firmware. Maybe if there's some change in how the firewall functions, that might be listed in there as well, because that's an important note that's often important to look at. And if there's any issues with downgrading or not being able to upgrade from certain versions, then we would list that in there, because typically you should be able to skip versions when it comes to firmware, but the release notes will normally have information related to that. Here's an example of an important note we put to do with a firewall change that might have affected some firewall rules, so we put that in because it could have affected after upgrading how the firewall operated, depending on how it was set up. In the PDF, we have all the previous versions, so if you are skipping a few versions, you can just in the one PDF see all the different firmware release notes. So that's very helpful to just scan through to look at it, and yeah, you can go through and see the previous versions. Here, skipping through, we can see an example of changes to the firewall behavior. There's also something that we do publish, which is to do with security advisories. So if we have any firmwares that have important fixes, then there would typically be a security advisory published around that. That's useful to look at because it can help you understand what the impact is of the security advisory and what it affects, because it could affect certain functionality, because the speed at which you need to update the firmware may relate to how the configuration is and what the issue is affecting, for you to help understand if there's any mitigations that allow you to make changes to the device without updating the firmware, or whether or not that's not applicable to you. A good example might be if there's a firmware that's marked as critical, but it's related to the wireless LAN driver, for example, then that wouldn't actually be critical for the non-wireless versions of the series. So if it was a 2865 compared to a 2865AX, that could have an impact on whether or not it's urgent for you to upgrade. But also it will typically say what feature or functionality is related. So if you're not using that functionality, then that might not require you to upgrade as quickly. We would still recommend updating any firmware to the latest version, but that might be something where you can look at scheduling in and seeing how rapidly you need to update the firmware. Next, I want to talk about some stuff around operational excellence to do with how you can future-proof and reduce any risks relating to managing the estate, and also optimizing some things around the refresh cycles. So one thing when it comes to future-proofing is you can, using ACS, very easily make changes en masse. So there's some scenarios where using provisioning, you can adjust the configuration on deployed units. One scenario around this might be if you've got an access control list in use to restrict management access to the management interface, and if there's a new network operations center being set up that has a different IP address that's not in the ACL. So how do you update that? So you might, if you're not using ACS, have to manually add that to each device, or schedule that through some other method. But what I wanted to show here was how you can use that with provisioning, because you can very easily update the configuration en masse using provisioning to do that. So here we've got an example on the right. We've got 6 different IP addresses listed in the ACL, but we want to add a new one because there's a new IP. So one way you can do that is through provisioning and the global parameters function, and a useful feature called sampling from an online device. Sampling from an online device takes the settings of an existing device and allows you to pick which settings you want, and then it will take the TR69 parameters for that to create a profile with those settings in. So you can pick the device, and then from the network, pick which device you want to sample from. So you'd pick the same model as the one that you're going to be updating. And then in the profile, you go to the web UI view, and you can click through and select the settings that you want to copy from. Here we've gone into the management and ACL menu and have ticked all of the 10 items in the ACL list with a green checkbox. Then we save that profile, and then it will then give us all the parameters there with the different parameter values, which is very handy for us to then be able to create a profile. Then before we make any changes, we'd need to check to see what settings are on the existing units that we're going to apply the profile to. A way you can help check that is by using one of the reports. So you can, in the reports menu, there's report tasks, and one of the report tasks is called a report type of device configuration. And that allows you to do a parameter orientated report on a network. And what you do is you pick the settings that you're interested in based on the parameters. So with the previous parameters that we've got there, we can go in and add a group with a list of parameters. And a really useful thing here is a wildcard with a star, so it will increment through all the different numbers. We saw there was the access list kind of numbered through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what you can do is put in a star there to replace the number, and then that will get every single parameter of that kind of branch of the settings. And you can do different groups as well there as well. So we can have another group that is the index number, but then we can look at the IP object for that number with the start IP. So we can look at that, run a report, and then that can help us with collecting information from each of the deployed routers in that network and get a report that shows what those are set to help with identifying if the parameter we want to set is free and it won't clash with something that's already set. Once we've then decided that, we can then go into provisioning global parameters, create a new profile. Here we've got the new WAN ACL entry, and with the sample from online device, we put in the settings we want to set. So here we've got the new WAN IP of 203.0.113.8, and here we've decided and identified that we'll put that into the profile 9, and then also we're going to put it into slot 7. So here we go into the system management after we've created the object, and then select here for that to go into the IP object after slot 9 there, the new WAN IP. And then save that, and then we have the required parameters that are needed. So it's actually just a few. One is 4 parameters relating to an IP object, and then we got the new entry in the ACL pointing to that index number 9. So then you can then apply that profile and apply that provision to a network, and then it will then go away and configure those devices. So that's a really helpful thing. Something else relating to firmware upgrades is something, it's a new feature in DREAS 5 I wanted to mention, which is to do with auto firmware upgrades. The DREAS 4 devices, there's no auto upgrade. It's all controlled by you. You can decide when to upgrade the firmware, either manually through the web interface or remotely through Vicor ACS. But with the DREAS 5 models, there's a new function which allows auto firmware upgrades to be enabled. You can see if it is enabled or not by looking on the system menu on the dashboard on the right hand side next to the firmware. It'll have a kind of indication saying auto firmware upgrade there, or it'll have red dots if it's not been enabled. And you can enable that through the system maintenance firmware upgrade. On the firmware upgrade page, you've got manual upgrade, which is just the manual upgrade of it, but then below that you've got scheduled update. So there you can, if I just scroll down a bit, you can see you can enable automatic upgrades, and there's different types. You can do it for general updates, or you can also do it for general and critical. So you can, if you want, only update if it's a critical fix, or you can just have it enabled to update routinely. And you can also pick the period as well. So you can set the upgrade timing, for example, in the middle of the night to do that, or you can specify a specific schedule. So that's very handy. And next thing around best practices is to do with managing firmware. I'm going to pass over to Joe, who's going to come in and talk us through some of the things you can look at relating to managing firmware updates. So with that, there's, I think, different approaches you can do. Let me just, are you there, Joe?
Yes, I am, Alex.
Yeah, let me just give you control on that, and then I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So as Alex mentioned, there are different approaches that you can use when upgrading firmware of your estate and using ACS. There's one method I'm going to be running through here, and this kind of follows on from the earlier slides in the presentation, where the first step would be looking at the release notes of any firmware that's been provided, looking at those new features, looking at the improvements that have been made, so you know what to expect when deploying this firmware, and what you can actually look into in terms of any new features you want to make use of. So that would be the first step. And secondly, an option would be to upload that firmware into the Vicor ACS platform. And the benefit of doing this via the menu there, Maintenance and File Manager, is you're able then to utilize that firmware for different upgrade methods that are available from Vicor ACS at a later date. Following on from that, we can then apply the firmware to a test device, which would have a production configuration applied to it. And this allows you to understand that completing the upgrade, doing some testing with the actual firmware itself and the new features and improvements that have been made. So there are 3 different methods that you can actually upgrade a device from Viger ACS. You can do that from the Viger ACS CPU configuration menu, and we have 2 other methods which allow scheduling, which is the maintenance firmware upgrade and the provisioning firmware upgrade. For this suggestion here, we're looking at doing the upgrade using the maintenance firmware upgrade job, and this just allows you to complete the test and utilize that same upgrade job when you're starting to roll out the upgrade to more devices as well. So it's essentially a template on the first instance. And when you create the firmware upgrade job, here's an example here within a specific user group. You can actually create multiple firmware upgrade jobs, and you can see the actual status of these jobs as well. The way of checking the actual success of the firmware upgrade, there's 2 ways. You can use the firmware upgrade job log, which we'll see in a moment, or you can also use the file transfer log, which is available from the monitoring logs menu. The view log option will give us an indication of the firmware version that was applied to which device, the status of that upgrade, if it was upgraded or not, and the date and time that that upgrade was successfully applied. So useful to actually get a review there of the firmware upgrade job itself if it's been completed. Once the firmware has been applied to that test device, you'd want to look at the management of that device. Can you access the CPU dashboard and check for the router uptime? I mentioned the router uptime there. It's a dynamic value in the CPU dashboard of Viger ACS. So if you see that dynamic value, you know that ACS has been able to contact the device and retrieve the current value. You could also use the CPU configuration menus, go through the different menus available on the device and ensure that the information is available to you. You can also use the Viger ACS test inform feature. So that's available in the advanced menu on the CPU dashboard, and that allows Viger ACS to communicate directly to the device and request certain information from the device itself. And as long as all the information is reported back, then that will be deemed a success. You'd also want to look at reviewing any production configuration that is on that test device that you've previously loaded onto it, and ensure that that's still working as expected and allowing for that device to work in a production environment. And once we've moved on from reviewing the firmware, applying it to a test device, then we can start look at rolling that firmware out to multiple devices across the estate. And there are different methods available here for doing the firmware upgrades. There's a maintenance firmware upgrade, and this gives you control of specific devices that you want to upgrade. So it might be 1 or 2 at a time. You might want to select larger numbers and for each firmware job, and then increase the number of devices as you go forward. The other method is the provisioning firmware upgrade, available in Viger ACS, and this works slightly differently. It applies at a network level to do the firmware upgrades. So we'll look a little bit more detail into those, and which one you choose really depends on the number of devices maybe you might have on your estate, and if you're doing any other actions, maybe some additional auto provisioning functionality using Viger ACS. So first of all, the maintenance firmware upgrade. Now, the benefit of using this type of upgrade this is allowing you to upgrade devices that are already registered to Vigra ACS, and this is available in the maintenance menu, firmware upgrade menu, and this allows you to specify certain devices for the upgrade job. So we've got a graphical interface here, and essentially we just need to create the name of the firmware job. We can enable or disable it. So this is something you can prepare in advance and enable when required. The upgrade time allows for scheduling. So now is essentially the next time the device sends an inform to Vigra ACS. At that point, the upgrade will be applied. The scheduled allows you to set a window, the start and an end time of when the upgrade will apply. It allows you to schedule that for out of hours. Applied firmware, that's a firmware that you would select, and this is a example here where we'd select a firmware that was previously uploaded to the file manager. The different options that we've got as well on the screen is we can highlight or select individual devices that need to be upgraded. You can see the current firmware version that's on them, and you can specify which ones will be upgraded to this new firmware here, for example, the 451 firmware. There is another option here for additional filtering. So this would help if you have many devices on your estate and you just want to focus on a specific device to be upgraded. That allows you to quickly identify the location of that device and set the firmware job for that device only. Now, the screenshots that I was provided in that previous slide was from a Vigra ACS version 3.8.0. There are plans for the upcoming version of Vigra ACS 3.8.1 that will allow for managing larger estates using this method. So instead of using the interface and individually selecting devices, we will have the ability to select the device pool option here and upload a CSV, and that CSV will be able to contain the MAC addresses of the devices that you want to include in the firmware upgrade job. So that will make it a lot easier to start rolling out the phased upgrade approach and increase the number of devices that you want to include in the firmware upgrades. So expect that in Vigra ACS 3.8.1. The next option that we could use is the provisioning firmware upgrade functionality. And this also will upgrade devices that are already registered to Vigra ACS, similar to the previous maintenance firmware upgrade option. But the benefit that this also brings is any new devices that join in the future to the specific network that the configuration is applied to, those new devices will also receive the upgrade, some automation there. And why might you want to put this in place? If you are using Vigra ACS to do some additional auto provisioning, there might be some global parameters or site-specific configurations being applied. The parameters that are being sent to the router, they will only be deployed successfully to the router if the device itself is running firmware that supports those parameters. So you might have devices that come into ACS and they need the firmware upgrade to successfully be fully provisioned. And the provisioning order is that when the device comes into ACS, the ACS will upgrade the firmware first, then it will apply some global parameters if there's any configured, and then the site-specific parameters. So this is where using this functionality is beneficial to ensure that that process is successful. And here you can see there is some additional device criteria functionality that's available to specify the model and the different upgrade types that you want. So target is essentially you want to ensure that all devices are on a specific firmware, no matter what firmware they're currently on. The current option allows you to specify only upgrade to the new firmware if it's on specific previous firmware. And there's also a auto upgrade functionality that's been added into ACS, similar to the functionality that was previously discussed on the JS5 device. But the target and concurrent options gives you a little bit more control in terms of when you want to upgrade the firmware. So another update for you in terms of what's upcoming in Vigor ACS 3.8.1. We're adding some batch functionality into the this provisioning firmware upgrade method, and this allows for you to control the number of devices that will be upgraded over a period of time, rather than the whole network being upgraded at one go. So that's going to give you additional functionality and give that control of how many devices you want to be upgraded at any time. So that concludes the slides there on the provisioning side that I just wanted to highlight, and the firmware upgrade approach that you could look at. Hope you find those helpful and make use of those new features in the upcoming 3.81 version.
Thank you, Joe, for that run through. That was great. So let's now go to just a summary, just to run through some key takeaways, and then we'll have an opportunity to go to some questions. So we've kind of run through some stuff on the product lifecycle management. So given some tips on how you can focus on planning effectively to manage the lifecycle of products and devices using some of the information that we published, and also kind of reviewing when that changes and keeping notes of what different customers have, but also continuing considering things around using Vigor ACS as a good way to have some triggers relating to kind of update periods as well, and also getting some assurance when it comes to customers knowing how long they're going to be able to have the devices managed for. The other thing around that is also firmware and patch management. This is really important and is a key part of maintaining the estate, keeping things up to date, and also the process around that is important as well, because keeping the devices up to date, but also scheduling and maintaining that new devices get updated, and that you're keeping in control of how you're updating things, and making sure that the customers have the stability in their environment is also important. And then we cover some stuff around some operational excellence to help you with delivering great outcomes and building trust with clients, and also the kind of stuff around the proactive discussions. And also there's some real key wins that you can get as well when it comes to being really aware of the capabilities of the products, because that can mean when there's changes, the product can be adjusted and reused with a new internet connection, for example, or if there are some potentially tricky changes when it comes to configuration, DNS changes, IP changes, then you can often do that at reasonably low cost if you're using ACS, because you can then schedule that and get that across it en masse, which is a really key thing for great long-term relationships with clients. But I think that's kind of enough when it comes to from us. Let's now go to some questions. So we have been taking your questions during the presentation, and I believe we'll also have Doris coming in, who will be able to help us with the Q&A and kick some off with throwing some questions at us. Are you there, Doris?
Yes, Alex. Thanks. We'll now be taking questions from the audience. So, Joe, this will be directed to you. We have a few questions regards to ACS and firmware upgrade. So one of the question is, can ACS automatically detect and list devices running outdated firmware versions?
Yes, so this is, I think, something that was covered in the presentation. There was a good slide that was provided in terms of the monitoring devices menu. That gives a good summary of the devices on your estate, but also it will highlight the devices if they're the color of the tick. If it's a green tick, is the latest version. If you've got different display of that, then you can see which ones are not running the latest version of ACS for firmware that can be supported via ACS.
Thank you. Another question related to that is, can you do multiple firmware? Sorry, let me rephrase this. Can multiple firmware versions be pushed simultaneously to different device groups in ACS?
You can create multiple firmware jobs, which allows for specifying which devices you want the upgrades to go to. So the maintenance firmware upgrade option allows you to create multiple jobs there, and you can select individual devices and which firmware they should receive. So hopefully that gives a solution to that.
I think it might be helpful there, Joe, just to highlight what are the limitations when it comes to networks and firmware, because I think the inverse of that question might be helpful for people as well.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned there was about the maintenance firmware upgrade that allows you to create individual jobs per device, because the maintenance firmware upgrade option is device specific. The provisioning firmware upgrade jobs, there is a limitation that there can only be one firmware job per network on that.
Yep. So so it's kind of around if you've had 3 different networks, you could have 3 different jobs, couldn't you? So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question in regards to ACS and firmware upgrade is, can ACS enforce a minimum firmware version policy so as to prevent devices from using older firmware?
The provisioning firmware upgrade option allows for the criteria to be set, where you can set that target firmware version to be used. So that's helpful if a device comes into ACS and is using an older version of firmware. We can use that firmware job method to automate and ensure that the devices are using firmware from a specific version that you want to use.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions in regards to security advisory. How do you notify the customers about security advisories, patches, and any mitigation guidance? Where can we find this information?
I think I can help on that one. So we have the website. Of course, there's the vulnerability page that we publish, but when it comes to proactive messages out, we use our mailing list. So if you've subscribed to the mailing list, then that one of the key things there is we send updates on any really important notifications. We have recently, and I can see there is a question relating that where an engineer's not received kind of emails on that. We've been looking into this, and we think that there's been some situations where people have inadvertently unsubscribed from the lists, and that's resulted in them not receiving some mailings from us. So we're in the process of looking how we can improve some of the lists to avoid that, because we think that people have in some cases been accidentally unsubscribing to all lists, and that's in some cases resulted in people being unable to receive some of the mailings. So we're discussing that internally to see how we can best structure that in the future to make it easier for people to understand which list they're on. If you have ever received a newsletter or a mailing from us, there is typically a manage subscriptions page at the bottom of that email. If you go into there, you'll be able to select your subscriptions, and if you've unchecked one, you can add yourself back in. There's also some stuff we're looking at adding into the dealer portal relating to managing subscriptions and firmware updates. But if you're not on a list, then if you go on and subscribe to the updates, then you'll be on that. But hopefully that kind of mainly answers the question there. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Alex. We'll take one last question, which is for devices that reach end of life, do you provide critical security patches beyond end of sale?
So the end of sale, yes, that's kind of almost always be something that we would be updating up until the point of the end of life date. When it beyond that, it becomes something that is something we would typically like to do if we can. And if you look at our track record, you'll see that if you randomly pick any of the products that's gone end of life, you'll probably find that there's been security updates released by us for those models. So we do try to where we can. There is always going to be, with older models, sometimes technical limitations. It can be possible, especially when it comes to some security protocols becoming obsolete, and in some cases older hardware might not be able to support some of the replacement security mechanisms. So it's something where it's difficult for us to guarantee that we can update, but we do, as a best effort, try and release updates where we can. But when it comes to kind of publishing something on the site, when it comes to what we're providing our kind of best guarantees for, we have to do it based off of the stated end of life date.
Thanks, Alex and Joe. That's all the we have for questions today. So I'll hand over back to you guys to conclude.
Thank you. Right, so I've actually got a question I'd like to ask people just before we wrap up, and feel free to reply to this by asking a question yourselves. The question I have is, what topics would you like us to cover in the webinars for the end of the year and early into next year? So if you've got any topics, now's a great opportunity for you just to ask that as a question now into the chat. That would be most appreciated. We really like looking at what topics are of interest. To just wrap up, I'd like to just thank you all for attending today, and thank you very much for the people behind the scenes who've been helping, but also to Joe and Doris who've helped on the presentation. We will be sending a recording of the presentation to anyone who maybe, if you've got any colleagues you think this would be useful to, you can send that on to them. There'll be a follow-up email with that and some kind of additional information. And also at the end, when you leave, there's a survey. So if you could complete the survey, that would be very appreciated, so we get your feedback on how the presentation went. If there's any follow-up, then please get in touch with us. The details are on the screen there. info@dratec.co.uk is a good email address to use for us if you've got any questions. But we hope you've found this useful, and thank you very much for attending.